Okay, so this is a video on diagnosing intermittent AC function on a second gen Dodge. That's a 94 to 02, and the problems that I had with my system. So what the problem was is that as I was driving my truck over time, if I parked or if I was stationary for, like, I turned the AC on, AC would work fine. If I came to a stop or if I was stationary, I would have to turn the AC off, let it wait for a minute, and then turn it back on. And it started working like this for a while. At first I thought I was like running low on refrigerant, or I was having a refrigerant issue, and so I would always be adding refrigerant or trying to fool with the refrigerant system. But what I noticed is if I had it on max, at first it would work all the time, as long as I had it at full power. And then, but if I ran it at any lower settings, like that, anything in here wouldn't work. So everything had to be running at full blast. These two, this setting would not work. So if I left it on this setting, it would alternate on and off and get hot and humid over a period of time. So that was pretty consistent, like especially when it gets hotter outside. But the weird thing was it would work when it was cold outside. So if it was cold outside, or like, in the 70s, low 70s, high 60s, it would blow ice cold. But I had this issue where I just rotate this off, let it sit for a minute, and then I come back on full power, and it would blow cold. And as long as I held it at max position, it would blow cold. I chased around a lot of different things. So I'm going to kind of run you through what I did. So first thing I started looking at was my low pressure switch, which is right here on the old accumulator. Now, this guy basically is what tells the compressor to turn on. And so I came over here, jumped it, turned the compressor on. I was like, cool, that works. So I replaced the low pressure switch, thought I was good to go. I connected a manifold set to the high and low side, and I was looking at my pressures, and I was like, oh, well, it looks like it seems kind of high, looking through the diag and the specs, which I found online, everything was reading high. So my low side was at like 50 and my high side was at 350 or so. So it was a little high, but I also used a temperature gauge, which I plugged into the inlet. So you can buy these at Walmart. They're like $20 or $10 rather. You shove that in here. It needs to go into the driver's side of the center console outlet. It should be reading. There's just like a manual you can download, but given the temperature was outside, it needed to be like 60 degrees or 55 degrees or some shit like that. Anyway, what I found was actually the issue with my intermittent cycling was that the connector that was going to my AC compressor had a wiring that was failing on the backside, because the insulation had broken, and over time, just because it's got, this is a 20-year-old truck, and the wiring was failing. And here's why this is important. Because the wiring was fraying, there were fewer and fewer wires that were making contact with the backside of the connector for the AC clutch, right? And that was the other thing that I noticed, is that the clutch was actually shut off. So when this thing was shut off, it seemed like, it was almost like there was a mechanical issue, but at the same time, the clutch wasn't being commanded to come on. And what it came to was that because this wiring was failing, the fewer wires there were, and the hotter it was outside, the hotter these wires got. And in an electrical wire, the higher the resistance, the hotter the wire gets, the hotter the wire is, the higher the resistance, which means the hotter it gets, which means the less voltage it's actually making it through and telling the clutch to turn on, or in this case, the electromagnet to actuate, right? So, because this was frayed, the wires were getting hot, the clutch was getting less and less power, and it was heating up more and more and more. The clutch would finally release because it ran out of juice, right? But it was still having voltage or current that was being run through this. And so I would have to power cycle it off, which would allow this wire to cool down enough that when I went back and cycled it back on, the wire was cool enough that it could get the starting power necessary to get this clutch engaged. However, the magnets that are in this clutch are in this setup will hold it even if the current drops really low. So what would happen is like, but the starting requirements are a lot higher. Okay, so to start it, it needs a lot of current, and then just to keep it there, it takes a lower current, and so it can operate at a lower current. But as soon as it would cycle off or shut off, it would it'd kill itself basically. So that required me coming through, splicing this. I kind of changed the wiring a little bit because it was all fatiguing, but I had to replace this connector, and that solved the problem of this intermittent issue that wasn't related to any of the other common diagnoses that you see for an intermittent issue. So when you're having a problem with your compressor not functioning and your AC not functioning, even though everything else looks like it should be good, you need to start looking at wiring, because the wiring itself could be a factor that's causing your system to not work right. So anyway, that's an intermittent AC function issue that I diagnosed on my 2001 Dodge Ram.